anatomically, modern humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. At the least, it's 200,000 years. Some say it's more like 600,000 years. Either way, it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. And it's only in the last 10, 12 at most thousand years that man has sort of started cultivating grains and things. So, as you said in the book, 90% or 80% of our human time, we haven't been eating bread, basically bread, flour and bread.
Yeah.
And so we're not really, in evolutionary terms and evolutionary timescales, we're not really evolved to be eating loads and loads of bread and grain and all sorts of things.
Well, we have a before the agricultural revolution, so before this big event in the Near East about 10 to 12,000 years ago, then we did consume wild grains. So there's evidence that we consumed wild grains. So, wheat is a grass, right? So there were wild forms of wheat. And there's evidence from places like South Africa, from limestone caves, they've found evidence of dehulling and preparation of grains dating back tens of thousands of years.
Would it be bread, though? Would they be making flour to make bread?
Quite possibly, yeah.
Okay.
But I mean very primitive forms of bread, like flatbreads, where you just, whether or not they were fermenting the bread.
Would they have had yeast in?
Well, wild yeast. So I mean that's how you would make like an artisan sourdough today. You create a sourdough starter by mixing flour and water and just exposing it to wild yeast that's floating around in the air.
Right.
But so there's a possibility that they were making bread as we might sort of recognize it, or simple things like flatbreads. But there was a season for it, as there is a season for all things, all foods. And so it's quite clear that our ancestors before the agricultural revolution weren't consuming grains as a staple. They weren't having bread every day. The vast majority of the evidence suggests that actually our ancestors were consuming prodigious amounts of animal products. And so if you go back even further than modern humans, there was a study published by some Israeli scientists that showed that our slightly more distant ancestors, for a period of about 2 million years, ate almost nothing but meat. So they were hyper-carnivores, I think is the term that they used. And that's the reason why we are as we are. That's why we've evolved. That's why we're not like chimpanzees and other apes. The consumption of massive quantities of animal protein and fats and the superior nutrition provided by animal products is an essential part of our evolution.
Just on that point, before we go on, would you describe humans, anatomically modern humans, as omnivorous, though?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. I would be the first person to say, yes, we are omnivorous. And if you look at... so there's a big thing about Paleolithic diets, right? The paleo diet, where people talk about, I'm going to consume a paleo diet that's in line with what my ancestors used to eat. But then the question is actually, which ancestors? Because, humans, there was no one paleo diet, let's say that. So, humans in different areas ate different things. So there's evidence, for instance, that Neanderthals would dive for clams and scallops and other shellfish. So they found evidence from caves in Italy on the Ligurian coast, I think, shows that Neanderthals were regularly diving to some depths, free diving, to collect shellfish. So, some Paleolithic peoples were consuming shellfish, but in other areas they wouldn't be consuming shellfish. And in other areas they might have had access to nuts. And so they were consuming nuts. And so depending on where you look, you'll find evidence for the consumption of different kinds of food. But broadly speaking, I mean, yes, our ancestors consumed animal products, but they also consumed wild grains. They also consumed fruits and berries. They also consumed nuts. So there's a kind of multitude of things that our ancestors ate. But one of the things they didn't eat, yes, they didn't rely as heavily as we do on carbohydrates, and in particular refined grains. They didn't consume as much sugar as we do. And they also ate seasonally. That's something that's important as well. That's something that you have to understand about the way that our ancestors used to eat, is that fruits were only available at a certain period of the year. And so, yes, they might have consumed large quantities of fruits when they were in season, but then there would actually probably have been a long period of time where they didn't eat fruits. They might have eaten tubers, maybe. from the ground, wild potatoes, things like that, wild parsnips, wild carrots, all that kind of stuff. But actually, they were eating seasonally, and we don't eat seasonally today. So that's one significant difference. We also eat far more carbohydrates, and especially grains.
In general, right?
Well, I mean, I think, there's a question about the quantities of food that our ancestors ate and whether we eat more than them, or whether our problems with health today are as a result of eating the wrong things. And I think I think that we probably do. The average fat person obviously does consume significantly in excess of what a normal person would have consumed 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago.
I think there will be many, if any. I always think there wouldn't be, but maybe there would have been any obese or morbidly obese hunter-gatherers 100,000 years ago. Would there have been one? Would that have been possible?
I don't. I mean, the general evidence suggests that hunter-gatherers were much more robust than we were, bigger than us. So you look at the skeletal record, and it's absolutely it's clear as day. I mean, if you look at a hunter-gatherer's skull, it's huge by comparison.
A human one, not a Neanderthal.
Human. So a human hunter-gatherer. So there's evidence that actually we've been getting smaller for a long time and becoming less robust, less sexually dimorphic. So there's less difference between the two sexes. I mean, there was a period where modern humans existed alongside megafauna, creatures like woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceroses. I mean, the amount of, I think somebody did a calculation actually of the number of calories in a woolly mammoth, and it's millions and millions of calories. It's enough to eat for a long time, and it's quite probable actually that our ancestors were consuming massive quantities of food when they downed things like megafauna. But I mean, they were consuming the right foods. They were active. They weren't subject to the kind of maladaptive influences that we're subject to as well, like chronic stress, for example. We're surrounded by white light. We don't sleep properly. We're exposed to environmental toxins in a way that our ancestors simply weren't, because we're talking about industrial chemicals. We're talking about chemicals that have only been synthesized in the last century or so. We are unique in our exposure. Modern humans today are unique in our exposure to chemicals like PFAS, and polyfluoroalkyl substances, phthalates, and all these chemicals.
Even cesium from nuclear tests and things.
Yeah, quite.
And the one thing I wanted to ask you about, do you think this would play into it? I always think it does, but maybe correct me if I'm wrong. The idea that infant mortality would have been absolutely through the roof. And therefore, if you made it to adulthood and the archaeologists find an adult skull, well, it's already pre-selected for an extremely strong individual anyway, because they just would not have made it to adulthood otherwise. Yeah,
there are a lot of interesting misconceptions about child mortality figures. And the fact that a lot of people don't seem to understand that the life expectancy of a group of, let's say, hunter-gatherers was 40. Let's say it was 40. But it was 40 because infant mortality was so high, and that skews the numbers, right? So a significant number of children died either during childbirth or soon after. But actually, yes, if you got to adulthood, you were just as likely to live into your 60s, 70s, or 80s. I mean, it was also a more violent time, and there are plenty more ways to die, I think, or some different ways to die in the past that have sort of been eliminated now, violent deaths in particular. But yes, I mean, obviously that has a selective effect, and I mean, we could go down a whole rabbit hole about what happens, when you remove these selection pressures on human beings and what it does to societies and what it does to the human organism itself.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.